Time now to take a closer look at some news stories in our regular Behind the Headline slot. And first, as the UN warns of the risks of inequality in vaccine distribution between rich and poor countries, Politico reports that British Foreign Secretary Dominic Raab is calling for vaccine ceasefires in all the world's conflict zones to allow healthcare workers in to vaccinate local populations. 10 years after the Libyan revolution, The Telegraph looks at the grim legacy left behind. It notes that Libya has gone from being the poster boy of the Arab Spring uprisings to the cautionary tale. At a time when everyone's trying to avoid the coronavirus, scientists here in the UK are going to infect volunteers with it. The Times says the aim is to learn more about how it's transmitted and the immune system's response. And it seems that Houston has a problem: not enough female astronauts. But Euronews says space managers in Europe have launched a campaign to recruit more women and people with disabilities in a traditionally male-dominated industry. Well, here with me to review all those stories are French-Algerian journalist Nabila Ramdani and the political editor of the Sunday Mirror, Nigel Nelson. Great to have you both with us today on Behind the Headlines. So let's talk first about these calls for vaccine ceasefires so people in conflict zones can be immunised. And Nabila, apparently 160 million people could be missed out because of instability in their area.
Well, that's an absolutely huge figure, Robin, and the whole concept of a vaccine ceasefire, I have to say, is an indictment of the absolute futility of war. But of course, any attempt to broker ceasefires has to be encouraged. But the idea is that vile, murderous, destructive wars currently raging in countries such as Yemen can be briefly stopped so as to protect civilians from coronavirus. Quite why we can't just have a permanent ceasefire so as to protect everyone permanently and to bring an end to the slaughter is beyond me. The Yemen war has been a particularly horrific one in terms of epidemics, including cholera, and that have already struck starving populations. And I hope that Dominic Raab is aware of this kind of reality, especially in a conflict zone where British-made armaments worth billions are contributing to the death toll. There was famously a ceasefire in Afghanistan in April 2001 when warring factions stopped killing each other for a while so that the United Nations could give out polio vaccines. And all well and good as far as preventing the spread of another awful disease is concerned. But within a few months, the proper Afghan war started. And it's been raging for 20 years. So I think the United Nations Security Council is an excellent place for countries like Britain to show themselves off as moral players, even when they fell very short in terms of their contribution to global violence. And it has to be said that there is much self-interest in this British plan too. The idea is that prioritising global access to vaccine will ultimately make Britain a far safer place is very true. This is to be commended, but again, it would be good to see the populations of countries like Yemen, Afghanistan, Syria given more priority in terms of being kept alive.
And Nigel, this all sort of feeds into the global importance of everybody around the world being vaccinated, in order to actually beat coronavirus.
Yes, that's right, because obviously if people aren't vaccinated, what will happen is the virus will mutate and come back to bite all of us. So it's absolutely essential. And I think Nabila's got it right there that Yemen should be the key target. There are 30 million people there, and they're desperately in need of vaccine. Now, the only way we're going to do that is to put pressure on Saudi Arabia and also Iran. So what we want is Saudi Arabia to stop bombing, and you want Iran to make sure that the Houthi rebels, obey a ceasefire. Now, obviously, we give arms to Saudi. There is a certain, as far as Britain's concerned, there are levers we could actually pull. The reason Dominic Raab is asking for this is because Britain has the rotating presidency of the UN this month, but we want to see a bit more action rather than just words.
OK, well, let's move on to Libya, where it's 10 years since their revolution. And as the headline that we're not seeing this headline, but the one I read said, "Where did it all go wrong?" So, Nabila, where do you think it did all go wrong?
Well, not only it went wrong, but it went spectacularly wrong. The optimism and energy of the Arab Spring certainly promised much in countries like Libya, where it has to be said democratic change was already on the way in 2011, and Western countries were moving in en masse to try and move it along. And Muammar Gaddafi was a monster, no doubt about it, but his regime was nothing like the one that has turned Libya into an international a pariah between the 1970s and 1990s. The most serious thing that went wrong was that hawkish Western politicians, and especially Nicolas Sarkozy of France, supported by David Cameron of Britain, saw the situation as a chance to show off Western firepower. They turned a legitimate mass show of dissent into an all-out conflict in which the West took part and in fact took sides in a civil war and once again imposed the wishes of on an Arab Muslim country. The aim of the UN intervention was officially to protect civilian populations, but this excuse was not adhered to, and instead Western forces used fighter jets and multi-million-pound missiles to impose a regime change. And now the second huge mistake, one that the West always makes in situations like this, is that they had no idea whatsoever what to do after they had bombed the old regime to pieces. And instead there was some outrageous grandstanding by Sarkozy and Cameron, who announced themselves as the great liberators of Libya, and then disappeared, never to be heard or even to be seen in the country again. And new Libya is in a state of civil war, full of warlords desperately trying to take full control. Some 30,000 people have died in the fighting since Gaddafi was deposed and killed. And so we effectively have an oil-rich African state full of highly educated people reduced to a basket case. The country has also become a base for terrorist groups, and the main people smuggling routes all pass through Libya too. So for those of us who spent a lot of time in Libya before 2011 and he could see massive changes going on, it really is a terrible prospect.
So, Nigel, as Nabila set out there, clearly a country in turmoil, but could there possibly be some hope on the horizon because elections are being held in December?
Yes, I mean, the situation at the moment is very much in the Libyans' hands, and there are some promising signs that things will get better. But yes, once again, it was the West making exactly the same mistake as we did in Iraq, that we set out to get regime change. The only difference from Iraq is we didn't put ground forces in, apart from a few special forces to guide the planes. So as always, we go in, we do these things, and then we don't think what comes afterwards. So it's an absolute tragedy that 10 years after the war started, it's actually still going on. And I just hope that Western countries actually learn the lesson from things like this and just don't keep doing it. I mean, we didn't win in Afghanistan. You can hardly call Iraq a great victory because of the mess we left that in. And Libya is in now the same situation.
Let's come back to the UK now, where scientists are looking for volunteers to be deliberately infected with coronavirus for so-called human challenge trials. Nabila, what are they trying to achieve here?
Well, I have always thought that there were plenty of guinea pigs as well as rats and mice queuing up for work like this. But human volunteers are logically the best when medics are looking at the effect of COVID-19 on human beings. And also logically, this is not massively surprising. They always say that whenever you receive a vaccine, you are actually receiving a little bit of the disease that you are being vaccinated against, hence the mild sickness people often feel after a vaccination. And it will be interesting to see who steps forward to take part in a human challenge like this. But I bet you anything, the vast majority will be students or other young people who tend to be far fitter and more adventurous than other members of the community. I think volunteers are expected to be paid about £4,000 for 2 to 3 week stay, plus probably about a year of follow-up appointments. And that is pretty good money, whichever way you look at it. And the government is investing more than 33 million in the project. So it will be very well run with masses of medical care by definition. So I can't see anyone having any serious problems at all.
And Nigel, I fear neither you nor I are eligible for this because you have to be between the ages of 18 and 30. But do you think that many people will be signing up for it?
Well, apparently there are volunteers queuing up. They need 90 of them, aged between 18 and 30. I certainly, even if I was in that age range, I'd hardly be volunteering to have COVID squirted up my nose. But people will do this. I mean, the issue is it's happened with cholera, it's happened with typhoid, they do it with flu. The only slight difference with COVID, of course, is the question of the rescue remedy if something goes wrong. We don't have a cure for COVID, and so that could become some kind of difficulty. However, the statistics are very promising that if you're in that age range, you're very unlikely to get the disease seriously, and you have about a 1 in 40,000 chance of dying of it, which is about the same as your chances of dying of a road accident. So from that point of view, it's good. I think they need to actually look into things like how much viral load you need for serious disease. There's a whole host of things you can't really do with animals. And let's hope at the end of this study, we'll actually understand COVID an awful lot better than we do now.
Mm-hmm. Well, Nigel, as you just said, that there's no cure that we know of. It just highlights how little scientists do know. Shall we move on to our final story about the European Space Agency? It wants more astronauts, and it's especially looking for women and disabled people. So, Nabila, why do you think that women have been underrepresented until now?
Well, I think it's part and parcel of the lack of diversity, full stop. And it has to be said that diversity is a wonderful thing in any field of human endeavor. And it would be marvelous to see a greater range of people given the chance to fire into space, as it were. And the most famous astronauts of all time were the pioneers of the 1960s, the Russians and the Americans who first went into space and indeed on the moon. And all were white males. And this was, of course, very typical of a time when white middle-aged men ran the world. We are slowly getting away from that. And this is another step forward. It's particularly heartening to think of disabled people being given the chance to live the dream in space too. And if the technology and monitoring is there to take people to the moon and planets and to get them back safely, then I can't see why it can't be adapted to get those with disabilities involved in these remarkable challenges.
And Nigel, do you think there is an element of this being somewhat self-selecting, as perhaps women looking at these kind of roles and thinking, this is just not for me?
Well, no, I don't actually. I think that this really has been discriminatory over the years. I mean, it's a disgrace that only 2 women have gone into space with the European Space Agency, and only 1 in 10 overall, and most of those are Americans. I think with the disability side of it, I mean, the words of the first British astronaut into space, Tim Peake, what he says is this is not about disability, it's about ability. And so when you're up in space and you're weightless, that often your lower limbs are not as important as they might be on dry land. So from that point of view, it gives people a huge opportunity. And obviously that the criteria for doing it is going to be pretty robust. You're going to have a master's degree. You're going to have been a top scientist for about 3 years. So it won't be an easy route. But with the International Paralympic Committee advising on it, really look forward into the right people getting up into space.
And Nabila, I'll give you the final word on this. I mean, is it just another positive example of organisations really realising that diversity really is the way forward to having a more broadly successful organisation?
Yes, indeed, and it's a beautiful example. I mean, science is always meant to be at the sharp end of things. So why not be at the sharp end of pioneering more women into space? Not least of all because there's an awful lot of young women who are particularly well represented in the fields of sciences, who I'm sure would be very excited about the prospect and indeed the possibilities of joining hugely exciting adventures like going into space.
Yes, I would love to have done it. Nabila Ramdani and Nigel Nelson, thank you very much indeed for joining us today on Behind the Headlines.